Jesus and his disciples went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. That other side, that's called the Sea of Tiberias. And crowds followed him because of the signs which he did on those who were ill. And Jesus, seeing the crowds coming to him, he went up into the hills. And seeing the crowds, he said to Philip, "How are we to buy enough food so that these people might eat?" And Philip answered, 200 denarii wouldn't buy enough so that each could get even a little. And Andrew said, "There's a lad here, and he has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what would that be among so many?" And Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was a lot of grass in that place, so they sat down. They numbered about 5,000 people. And Jesus took the bread, and he gave thanks, and then he distributed the bread to the people as much as they wanted. So also with the fish. And when they had eaten their fill, he said to his disciples, "Now gather up the fragments left over, that nothing may be lost." And we filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, which the people ate. And when the people saw this, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is coming into the world." And Jesus, seeing they were about to come, take him by force, make him king, he again withdrew by himself up into the hills. And the evening came, and the disciples went down to the sea to get back into a boat to go back across the Capernaum. And it was dark now, and Jesus hadn't joined us yet. And a strong wind blew, and the waters of the sea rose. They rose so high, and we rowed 3-4 miles. And then we saw Jesus walking. He was walking on the rough water of the sea, and he was coming to the boat. And we were terrified. And he said, "It is I. Don't be afraid." We took him into the boat, reached the land where we were headed. The word of the Lord.
Thank you, Ken, for so beautifully reading the chosen passage for this morning. I feel like Ken should have been the preacher this morning. We are all fighting something in our personal lives, in our families, and we see so many people fighting for justice, fighting for equality, and so many things around us. And also, generally, there are so many collides that we're all facing, and we're trying to move walls in our lives. And this morning, with the help of John's Gospel from chapter 6, verses 1 to 15, I would like to draw our attention to the meaning of abundance, providence, and availability of resources. I want to jump straight to the question of how do scarcity and control operate in today's world? I feel like that's an important question in today's context of how there's so much of false narratives that are going on in and around us. Today, the meaning and the word abundance is so political. The UN estimates 2.2 billion people still lack safely managed drinking water. According to World Health Organization, out of 733 million people, 1 in 11 were undernourished in 2023. Don't we have enough resources to provide for the hungry and the needy? Who gets to eat, who is seen, who is forgotten, and how systems either hoard or share are deeply theological and political questions. Now, in John 6:1-15, I'm sure you have heard so many times about Jesus feeding the 5,000. For me personally, Jesus feeding these 5,000 is not just a miracle of food, but it's a radical act of resistance against systems of scarcity, imperial control, and marginalization. It offers a vision of God's economy where abundance overflows out of compassion, out of community and the margins, and not wealth and power. In John 6, in this passage, we see that Jesus is actually hosting something like an all-you-can-eat kind of a picnic, right? Where nobody's checking anybody's ID cards, there's no surcharge, but also there is plenty of leftovers. As we heard the passage, when Ken was reading, that there were actually 12 baskets of leftovers. And this number 5,000 is just the men who were actually counted, but not including women and children who were actually present in the crowd. So I'm imagining that there were more than 5,000 people in the crowd who were actually fed, and miraculously so many baskets of food were left. I want to walk through this chosen passage and help us get the attention to the geography, people, and the power and provision. In verse 1, we see that Jesus is walking to the other side of Tiberias, which was actually one of the largest Jewish city in the Galilee province. And the crowd who were actually following Jesus were actually on the way to Jerusalem because it was the Jewish Passover time, and they were journeying towards Jerusalem. And the people who followed Jesus followed him because of the miracles and the healings and the performances that Jesus was actually doing. And they envisioned that if they followed this Jesus, they would see another miracle being performed, with the hope in their hearts that they did not trust what was in their circumstances or in the realm of the empire, but they trusted God's providence, and that's why they followed Jesus. Now, when Jesus asked Philip, where will we buy enough food to feed all these people? Now, when Jesus is asking Philip, we understand that Jesus might actually have been testing Philip's faith, whether Philip was going to trust that Jesus would supply all of the needs and not consider their limited resources, because they were away in the mountains, and we imagine how it was away from the city, and Jesus had 12 disciples, and if Jesus had actually ordered these disciples to go into the city and bring food or bring something to feed the crowd, it would have been impossible, imagining the ratio between the 12 disciples and the number of crowd that was actually there. And so there is tension between the availability of resources, but also with the hope and faith that Jesus was going to perform another miracle. We see that in this mountainside, Jesus performs this miracle not in temples or in the presence of a large crowd. Not in the large crowd, but in the city center, but by the mountainside among the hungry and the poor. That means Jesus is also paying attention to the margins in the society, and this reflects God's preferential option for the marginalized, which is a recurring theme in the Bible. We also see the difference between the divine economy and the empire's economy. During the time of Jesus, there was a lot of things happening and overpowering by the Roman Empire. I love how John brings the idea of dualism in his gospel. Like I mentioned, the divine providence versus the empire's rule and power, between God's kingdom versus human empire, and the presence of generosity versus greed. We see this in the Roman Empire's way of ruling over the people. The Roman Empire thrived on scarcity, taxation, control of food and land, and power hoarded in at the center. Now, Jesus, in contrast, feeds freely and abundantly without restoring for himself or his disciples. And just like I said, the way Jesus is providing out of the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes is like an all-you-can-eat counter where anybody and everybody is welcome to eat all they can eat, and nobody is standing beside them saying, "You should eat enough, stop it." There is sharing and not storing for oneself. We also see the young child's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, that even if our offerings are small, we can make great impacts. The voices from the margins in the Bible are central to God's work. It was not just women in the Bible, but also children who were sidelined, who were unrecognized and not important during the time of Jesus. Jesus being Jesus, he could have done this miracle and fed the 5,000 and more through some alternatives, but Jesus is bringing to us even today this example of feeding with the child's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, that even an insignificant child, an insignificant group of people in the society can do so much significant things and works through Christ. John 6:1-15 reminds us that God works through what is often overlooked, including children, the poor, and small acts of generosity, which is again political inversion. Now, in verse 15, we also see that after feeding the 5,000 and more people, that Jesus is actually running away from the crowd because he hears and he knows that these people are actually recognizing that he could be or he is the Messiah. And Jesus running away or withdrawing from the crowd is a sign that Jesus is resisting nationalist, triumphalist, or militaristic uses of his power. That abundance is not for political dominance, but for communal healing. I want to pose a few questions for us to reflect as we sit here and get out of this door. Where is plenty being politicized today? Who controls food, housing, health, and resources? What does it mean to participate in the politics of plenty as Christians today? Today, abundance is not neutral. It is shaped, priced, withheld, or distributed by systems of power. What we call plenty today is often a result of decisions about who is allowed to access it and under what conditions people are allowed to access it. In many countries, private hospitals and many public spaces thrive while public health systems crumble. While there are many empty houses, even here, there are also many families and individuals living in shelter homes. In India and across the global south, indigenous and rural communities often live in scarcity created by dam projects, mining, or even polluted rivers. There's so much that the media is not presenting today, but there is also so much of injustice and marginalization, oppression, and political censoring that is happening in and around the world today. We have policy and law, false capital ownership, and of course the media that creates gap and narrative and engineers who deserves how much amount of resources that is to be made available. Even in New York, study reveals that 1 in 3 adult New Yorkers has relied on food pantries after the pandemic. Scarcity here is not the absence of food or resources, but of wages and affordable groceries. To follow Jesus today means fighting against injustice, confronting the systems that hoard abundance. To follow Jesus is to trust God's abundance, resist empire's logic, and participate in the creation of a world where everyone is equally treated, where everyone equally eats, and there's still food that is left over. The crowd that came to listen to Jesus had this radical hope in them that even on that day they were going to see Jesus performing miracles. That Jesus was going to do something supernatural that was not in their circumstantial realm, that is the presence of the Roman Empire that was deciding who is going to be above whom, who is going to receive how much. There was the presence of so much there was the presence of so much power even in the Roman Empire. Today, as we sit here, I just pray that God will set our eyes open to see the margins, will help us stretch our hands that are ready to share, and hearts bold to believe that God's abundance is greater than the world's fear. Amen.